My name is Margaret, but everyone around here calls me Maggie. I've lived across from the Walsh family for almost 5 years now in this quiet little neighborhood in Cohasset. I moved here after my husband passed, wanting something peaceful and steady. And that's what it was, at least until all this happened. When Anna and Brian Walsh moved in, I remember thinking how young and hopeful they looked. Their 3 kids were just little things then, full of energy and noise. You could hear their laughter echoing up and down the street, the slap of little shoes on pavement, the clatter of bikes on the curb. It reminded me of when my own kids were small. Anna had a spark to her, always moving, always with something to say. She'd stop to chat if she saw me out front. "Hi, Miss Maggie," she'd call, and she'd ask how I was feeling if the cold was bothering my arthritis. Small kindnesses like that go a long way when you live alone. Brian was more reserved. He'd nod when we passed on the sidewalk, but I don't think I ever heard him ask about me or the house. He seemed busy all the time, always fixing something. In the evenings, I'd see him in the driveway with his head under the hood of the car, tools spread out like a little army. I figured he liked to keep his hands busy. One afternoon a couple of years back, I was struggling with a heavy box of old clothes I was trying to donate. Anna saw me and crossed the street, lifting it like it was nothing. She didn't even hesitate. "Let me help, Maggie," she said. "You shouldn't have to lift that yourself." I never forgot that. I'd see Anna at the market on Saturdays, her kids in tow, usually juggling groceries and wiping little noses at the same time. She'd tell me about her plans for the backyard, flowers she wanted to plant, maybe a little vegetable garden come spring. She always looked tired, but she never complained. When I think about it now, there was something about Brian I couldn't quite put my finger on. He was polite enough, but there was a tightness around his mouth, like he was always holding something back. But I didn't dwell on it, it wasn't my business. People have their own ways of dealing with life. In December of 2022, things seemed normal. The kids played in the yard after school, bundled up against the cold. Anna waved when she saw me at the mailbox, even if she looked a bit rushed. I remember how she decorated the porch with those little white lights, nothing fancy, but it made the house look warm and welcoming in the dark. Then January came, and the world turned cold in more ways than one. I didn't see Anna as often, but I figured it was the weather, or maybe just the start of a new year. Life has a way of sweeping you along in those first busy weeks, or at least that's what I told myself. I didn't know then how quickly everything would change. How the quiet comfort of our street would be replaced by the buzz of police cars and the low murmur of worried neighbors. How the house across from mine would go from being just another home to something else entirely, a place people looked at sideways, with questions in their eyes and fear in their hearts. The first time I realized something was wrong, it was early January. I was sweeping my porch that morning, bundled up against the cold, and I noticed Anna's car wasn't in the driveway. That wasn't so unusual by itself. She was always coming and going, busy with work and errands. But that day the house just felt still. Too still. Normally, even if Anna was out, the kids would be running around, chasing each other or riding their bikes up and down the street. But that day it was quiet. No little voices calling out, no laughter echoing off the houses. Just that winter hush that makes everything feel a bit closer, a bit heavier. At first I told myself not to worry. Maybe she was visiting family or just needed a break. But as the days went by, the feeling in my chest got tighter. I didn't see Anna, not even once, and that was strange. She was the kind of person who never stayed hidden for long. Brian was still there though. I'd see him from my window, coming and going at odd hours. He'd stand on the porch sometimes, just staring out across the street like he was lost in thought. I wanted to go over and ask if everything was all right, but I hesitated. It didn't feel like my place. Then the police came. I was taking out the trash when I saw the cruiser pull up in front of the Walsh house. 2 officers got out, knocking on the door in that calm, measured way they have. Brian answered, and from where I stood, I could see the surprise on his face, or maybe it was something else. He stepped back to let them in, and the door closed behind them. After that, there were more visits. More police cars parked along the curb, more quiet conversations that ended with the officers leaving with serious faces. The whole street felt like it was holding its breath. People started to talk, not loudly, but in those careful whispers you use when you're afraid of what you might hear. One afternoon, I saw one of the officers knock on my door. "Mrs. McCarthy?" he said. I nodded, hard in my throat. He asked if I'd seen Anna, if I'd noticed anything unusual in the past week. I told him what I knew, which wasn't much really. That Anna always waved when she saw me, that she was a kind woman who loved her kids. That I hadn't seen her since New Year's. He wrote it all down in a little notebook, thanked me, and moved on. I watched him go to the next house, the next set of questions. It felt like we were all part of a story we didn't want to be in. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Anna's smile, about the way she'd always pause to ask how I was doing, even when she was in a hurry. I thought about her kids, how they must be wondering where their mother had gone. It was the not knowing that was the worst, that quiet fear that creeps into your bones and won't let go. By the time the second week rolled around, you could feel it in the air, that heavy, watchful quiet that settles over a place when something isn't right. People on our street started to look at each other differently. The usual friendly nods turned into wary glances, like we were all waiting for the other shoe to drop. I'd see Brian sometimes, standing out on the porch in the early mornings when the world was still gray and cold. He'd stand there with his arms folded, eyes down, like he was trying to figure out what to do next. I'd wave if I caught his eye, but he never waved back. Just that blank stare, like he was seeing something the rest of us couldn't. Some evenings, I'd see the kids in the front window, their little faces pressed against the glass. It broke my heart to see them like that, so still, so quiet. They'd always been full of energy, racing around the yard, shouting and laughing. Now they just watched, like they were hoping to see their mother come walking up the path. The neighborhood started talking, of course. It's what happens when there's nothing else to do. People would gather at the ends of driveways or stop each other in the grocery store. Have you heard anything? Did they find her yet? Do you think she ran away? No one wanted to say the other thing, the thing we were all thinking but too afraid to put into words. I remember one day in particular, it was cloudy and cold, and I was out checking my mail. Mrs. Jensen from 2 houses down walked over, her face pale. They say the police found something, she whispered. Bags or something like that. She shook her head, eyes wide. Can you imagine? I didn't want to imagine. I didn't want to think about what might be in those bags or what Brian might have done. But once you hear it, you can't unhear it. The thought just sits there in your mind, dark and heavy. The police came by again that week. 2 officers knocked on my door, polite but firm. They asked the same questions as before. Had I seen Anna? Had I heard anything unusual? I told them again that I hadn't, that the last time I saw her she'd looked tired, but she'd smiled like she always did. One of the officers wrote it all down, and then he paused, looking up at me. If you remember anything else, even the smallest detail, please let us know. I nodded, but what else was there to say? I was just a neighbor, just someone who watched from across the street. After they left, I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I thought about the little things, the way Anna always had a kind word, the way Brian never really looked you in the eye, the way their house had gone from warm and full of life to cold and closed off. It felt like watching the lights go out in a place you used to think was safe. The nights got longer after that. I'd lie awake and wonder what I'd missed, what I should have seen. But all I had were the same questions everyone else did and no answers. By the middle of January, the street didn't feel like home anymore. The Walsh house sat there with its closed blinds and its silent rooms, and every time I looked at it, I felt a little shiver run down my spine. Even the kids' toys in the yard looked different, like they didn't belong in a place where laughter had died out. The police cars became a regular sight. They came and went at all hours, their headlights sweeping across the houses as they parked in the early mornings or late at night. I'd watch them from my window, their dark uniforms moving in and out of the house like shadows. One afternoon, I saw them carry out a bag, big and brown, the kind they use for evidence. I couldn't see what was inside, and I didn't want to. I just knew it wasn't something good. I watched as they loaded it carefully into the trunk of one of their cars, the officers talking in low voices as they worked. I think that was the moment it really sank in for me, that this wasn't going to end with Anna just coming home one day, smiling and saying it had all been a misunderstanding. Something terrible had happened, and it was unfolding right across the street from me. People on our block stopped pretending everything was normal. We talked in careful voices, glancing at the Walsh house like it might hear us. Mrs. Jensen said she'd heard that the police had found a broken knife in the basement. Mr. Howard from next door said he'd seen Brian loading up bags in his car late at night, but he couldn't be sure what was inside. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together, and yet somehow you knew exactly what they showed. You just didn't want to look at the whole picture. One evening I stepped outside to get some fresh air. It was cold and damp, the kind of night that seeps into your bones. I saw Brian's porch light flicker on for a moment, then off again. I stood there in the dark, holding my breath, listening for any sound from inside the house. But there was nothing. Just the wind and the quiet creak of the trees. A few days later, the police knocked on my door again. The same questions, the same polite tone. But this time, there was something in their eyes, a kind of finality, like they already knew what had happened, even if they couldn't say it yet. I told them everything I could remember. How Anna had always smiled, how Brian had always seemed so serious. How the house had changed in those last few weeks, gone from a warm place to something cold and hollow. They wrote it all down and thanked me, and then they were gone. That night, I sat by the window and watched the lights in the Walsh house. I thought about Anna, about the way she used to stand out front with the kids, her laughter bright and easy. I thought about how quickly that light had gone out, and how we'd all been left in the dark. It was around the third week of January when the real horror started to come out. I remember waking up one morning to see the news trucks parked at the end of the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like silent witnesses to the nightmare that was unfolding. I'd known something was coming, we all had. But nothing prepares you for the moment when it stops being rumors and becomes fact. The police had found what they were looking for, and it was worse than any of us could have imagined. They said they'd found bags in a dumpster near Brian's mother's house in Swampscott. 10 of them, filled with things no one should ever have to see. Blood-soaked rags, pieces of carpet, gloves, and a Tyvek suit, all of it marked with blood. And there in the middle of it all was Anna's red Prada handbag, a bright spot of color turned into a marker of something unthinkable. The news said there was DNA, proof that Anna had been in those bags, proof that Brian had been there too. I sat at my kitchen table, the cup of coffee in my hands gone cold, and I felt like the world had tipped on its side. Then there was the talk of that iPad, one of the kids' devices, they said. Searches that no one wants to imagine. How to hide a body. How soon does a body start to smell? How to clean up blood. Hearing that made my skin crawl. I pictured Brian in the dark of night, hunched over that little screen while his children slept just down the hall. After that, the police stopped knocking on doors. They didn't need to ask any more questions, they had the answers they were looking for. And the rest of us, we were left to try to understand how the man we'd waved to across the street could have done something like that. I thought about the nights I'd seen him in the driveway working late into the cold evenings. I thought about how he never really smiled, not the way Anna did. How he always seemed to be carrying something heavy even before all this happened. The neighborhood felt different after that. The kids didn't play in the street anymore. The sound of laughter was gone, replaced by the low hum of news vans and the whispered conversations of neighbors who didn't know what to say to each other anymore. For days I didn't want to leave my house. I kept the curtains drawn, the TV on low, just trying to make sense of it all. But there's no sense to be found in something like this. Just a cold emptiness where a family used to be. When they finally charged Brian with murder, it was like the last piece of a terrible puzzle clicking into place. The street felt quiet in a different way then. Not the cozy, peaceful quiet of a winter evening, but the kind that settles in when there's nothing left to say. I'd see the kids leave with relatives, their little backpacks slung over their shoulders. They didn't wave, and I didn't blame them. How could you explain any of this to children? How could you make sense of what had happened to their mother, of what their father had done? Sometimes reporters would still come around, knocking on doors and asking if we wanted to talk. I never did. What was there to say that could make any of it make sense? I'd seen enough, the police cars, the bags carried out of the house, the weight of Brian's silence. It was all burned into my mind. The Walsh house sits there still. The blinds are always closed, the front steps empty. Sometimes I catch myself looking over, half expecting to see Anna's bright smile, her little wave across the yard. But I know I never will. People around here moved on in their own ways. The neighborhood kids started playing outside again, though they never went near the Walsh house. People still tend their gardens, still mow their lawns. Life goes on, even after something like this. But the street doesn't feel quite the same. I've had people ask me if I ever suspected anything, if there were signs I should have seen. I don't think there were. Or maybe there were and I didn't want to see them. It's easier to believe that the worst things happened somewhere else to other people in other places. When I think of Anna now, I try not to think about the bags or the basement. I think about the way she smiled, the way she'd laugh when the kids were running wild in the yard. That's how I want to remember her, not for how her life ended, but for how she lived. I don't know what made Brian do what he did. Maybe no one ever will. Maybe that's something that will stay locked away in the quiet of that house forever. But for those of us who watched it all happen, who heard the laughter turn to silence, it's something we'll carry with us always. The world keeps turning and the street goes on. But sometimes at night, when the wind picks up and the trees rustle outside my window, I remember. I remember Anna's wave and Brian's silence. And I remember how quickly everything we think we know can slip away.